Welcome to the Power of Reading, a book review program that discusses the latest Catholic books. A book is a dream you hold in your hand. This program is prepared for Radio Maria Nairobi and presented to you by the Daughters of St. Paul.
Hello, dear listeners, and welcome once again to the Power of Reading program, a book review program here at Radio Maria Nairobi, a Christian voice in your home. I am your host and presenter, Sister Beatrice from the Daughters of St. Paul, and together we continue this journey into the world of books. And this program actually aims at presenting to us the classical, latest, and important Catholic books. We want to make sure that we have that reading culture and we are all able to enjoy the vast knowledge, the vast treasure that we have in our books, because books are very, very important in our growth in faith, but also in our own development. And we know today we are still struggling a bit with the book, because with our modern technology, which has taken up a lot of our time, our space, our imagination, sometimes reading is put on the periphery. In fact, sometimes as Africans, we are accused that we are not great readers. But we know that among us, we have great readers, and actually, this is a value that we should continue to promote in our homes, in our families, in our society, because reading has good and lasting effects both for our faith and also our development and also for our knowledge. And we know that even though we have the internet, we have the modern technology, the book is still one of the best inventions in human history and in the development of the human person. And today in our program, we shall be reviewing a very interesting book. Actually, I would call this a serialization, because we are going to go through this book for the next 5 programs. And the book is A History of the Catholic Church. A History of the Catholic Church. I know that sometimes you're not so much interested with historical books, but history is a great, great teacher. And our book review for today and for the next 5 programs, we shall be looking at A History of the Catholic Church. This book is a publication of Pauline's Publications Africa, and it is also a book that is written by Brother Norbert Bruckmann. Brother Norbert Bruckmann is a Marianist brother, and Father Umberto Pescantini, who is a Comboni missionary. This book was written quite a while ago, but it has gone through several revisions. And there was a revision and updating that was done by Father Stephen Jure. Father Stephen Jure is a diocesan priest from the Catholic Diocese of Eldoret. So this is a very, very interesting book. Actually, it's not in a very long format as you would expect of any book of history. But one of the sacred things that we do with our lives, even the way we look at our faith, is to understand the history, to see the journey that a person has made, an institution like a church has made, or even a country has made. So history is very important because it also helps us to understand why we are here, why we have certain customs, certain situations, what happened prior to that, and that can also inform our next steps in our journey. So we are going to serialize A History of the Catholic Church in our next 5 programs, and I'm sure it will be a very, very interesting journey for all of us. And as we begin this program, I'm going to take a few thoughts from the introduction of this book, what the authors of this book expect of us as readers or even as inquirers into the history of the Catholic Church. And the authors tell us that every Christian needs to know the story of the Church, the people of God. And through its history, one comes to a deeper understanding of the ways of divine providence made manifest in our lives. We also need to realize, even as disciples, that the Church is not perfect, and it is a sinful church, sometimes often stumbling, sometimes unfaithful, but always, always lifted up again by divine grace. And even the failures and sinfulness of the church are lessons in Jesus' redemptive work, which goes on through time. So actually, reading the history of the church, as the writers of this book tell us, is also a sacred activity, an activity where we also see how the hand of God guided our ancestors in faith, our forefathers in faith. Of course, the authors tell us that this book is written first of all for Catholics so that they may better understand and appreciate their heritage. At the same time, the authors hope that people from other religions, other Christians will find something in it, something they can benefit, because our Christian history as Christian churches is a shared one. We share a history, even with our Protestant brothers and sisters, for the first 15 centuries of the existence of the church. And so there is something that they can also learn from this book. And actually, one of the beautiful things that the authors of this book have done is when they come to the time of the Reformation and all that, they have really treated the whole scenario with a lot of dignity, with a lot of respect. They did not take it as a moment maybe to chastise those who left the church or even to chastise the church itself, but with that respect and dignity, and try to look at that situation in a very objective manner. And actually, they say they were guided by the words of St. Paul in the letter to the Ephesians chapter 4, verse 5. The words of St. Paul in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 5 says, "One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all." So this book is a kind of a foundation that Jesus gave to the church. And of course, we are told also that, you see, there are two historians that came together. There was Father Bruckmann and also Father Umberto Pescantini. And the book was developed from the works of these two. I'm not very familiar with Father Bruckmann, who is a Marianist father, not a Marist, Marianist father. But Father Umberto Pescantini also taught church history here in Kenya for a very long time. So he's one of the best teachers of church history that I have also encountered. So this is very, very important. And actually, many other people are involved in helping to make sure that what is shared in this book comes out in the best manner possible. And besides that, also, as I mentioned, the authors of the book, Father Norbert Bruckmann and Umberto Pescantini. I also mentioned that there was Father Stephen Njure, a diocesan priest from the Diocese of Eldoret, who also got involved in a bit of the revision of this book, because anything historical, the facts never change, but the history continues. So we have to keep adding to this book some historical aspects that maybe were not present at the initial writing of the book itself. So we are going to take our first break as we sit and prepare ourselves to have this long journey, but beautiful journey, with a history of the Catholic Church, a book written by Fathers Norbert Bruckmann and Father Umberto Pescantini, and a book that is really, really important for anyone who calls themselves a Christian and especially a Catholic to understand our heritage, where we come from, our history. So let's take a break, and then we shall come and start seeing how this book is divided and start enjoying also a bit of the content of this book. This is the Power of Reading program here at Radio Maria Nairobi, a Christian voice in your home. I am your host, Sister Beatrice from the Daughters of St. Paul. And today in the Power of Reading program, we are reviewing the book, A History of the Catholic Church, a book written by Father Norbert Bruckmann and Father Umberto Pescantini. Now, first of all, this book is divided into 18 chapters. I always like to present the contents of the book because that helps us to understand where the book wants to take us, what the book is talking about. And these 18 chapters, of course, we have the first chapter that talks about the beginnings of the church. And of course, chapter 2 talks about persecution. Remember that the persecution of the church began very, very quickly soon after the Feast of Pentecost. There was a great persecution, especially in Jerusalem, but eventually that spread out in the whole of the Roman Empire. Then we have also chapter 3 that talks about the great test of faith, the great test of faith. Of course, the church also had to grapple through the new understanding of the experience of God for the people, what was happening, different people coming together. There was like a formation of a new understanding of God. So they had to answer the great questions of faith, like who is God? Then, of course, they had the Christ. So who is the Christ? Who can be saved? What is the Bible? Remember, the Bible initially was just the Old Testament for the Jews. How did they come about with what we call now the New Testament? But they had to take certain decisions as a church to be able to make these very bold steps. Then, of course, we have chapter 4 that deals with the churches of the Nile, the churches around the peninsula of Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula there. So you have the Church of Alexandria, you have a Church of Unity, the desert monks. We know also the faith spread very early into Ethiopia, and also Nubia, which is part of Egypt and part of Sudan in our modern day understanding. Chapter 5 talks about the German immigrations. Here we will meet the barbarians and other tribes that invaded the Roman Empire and what that really meant in terms of us as a church. Remember, the church also is not built in a vacuum. It's built in an already existing society. Chapter 6 deals with the issue of Islam, the conflict with Islam. Chapter 7, the Christian life in the Middle Ages, very, very important. Chapter 8 deals with the age of unrest, the time that after the Middle Ages, we know that those were the low-key moments after the decline of what we call the Roman Empire. And here we have the age of unrest. We have the Byzantine Church, that is the Eastern Church. Then you have the Great Schism of 1054. I know most of us don't even know that even before the Protestant Reformation, there was a kind of division in the church that we call the Great Schism, where the Eastern and the Western part of the church had a kind of split because of theological misunderstandings, the great distances, and many other things that we shall look at. Then, of course, we have the conciliarism and also the Renaissance, the renewal. Remember, the rebirth of the society after the decline of the Roman Empire. Chapter 9 deals with the division of Christianity, and that is the 15th century, where we have the Reformation. We talk about Luther, we talk about John Calvin, the Anabaptists. We have also the spread, how the Reformation itself was spread. Chapter 10 talks about a renewed church, a living faith. Chapter 11, new world beyond the seas. Chapter 12, the spirit of revolution. Chapter 13, the making of a secular Europe. Then we have chapter 14, the ends of the earth. Chapter 15 deals with the new worlds, new churches, us included. Chapter 16 deals with the great Protestant awakening. Chapter 17, gains and losses. This deals with the two world wars, the World War I, World War II, and the consequences of these two world wars, communism, Cold War, and Christian democracy. And of course, chapter 18 is complementing the Counter-Reformation. This is what is done with the Second Vatican Council. So this is the division that we have of our book, A History of the Catholic Church. Actually, dear listener, I would want really to encourage you because this is a beautiful journey that you are going to make. I have to make a confession that I am a great lover of church history because it helps me, and I believe it helps many of us to understand things. Sometimes when you don't understand why something is done in a certain way, it's very difficult to get involved with that. You'll have doubts, you'll have questions, or even worse, you might find someone else giving you misleading information about the life of the church, some practices within the church, some beliefs in Christianity. So a bit of history does not hurt. It helps. It really, really helps for us to understand our faith, to understand our journey. Now, when we go to chapter 1 and look at the beginnings of the church, of course, when we are talking about the beginnings of the church, the authors already present to us that really our starting point. Of course, we have those roots in Judaism, in the Jewish religion. That's why we even still keep the Old Testament, the Hebrew scripture, as part of our Bible, our revelation that God wanted to reveal to us. And the author here tells us that Christians of all traditions have always proclaimed Jesus of Nazareth to be the Messiah. Every Christian denomination at least recognizes that Jesus is the Messiah, the promised one sent by God to transform human history, and Jesus is the foundation stone upon which Christianity is built. And of course, this we know about the stone which the builders rejected has become the cornerstone, already quoted in the Old Testament in the Psalms, but also repeated in the first letter of St. Peter, chapter 2, verse 4-8. And of course, Christians argue bitterly among themselves about whether Jesus was both God and man or human, about the meaning of his mission, about how it is to be followed. But no Christian denies that he is central to the mystery that is the Christian church. So that understanding that our foundation is from Jesus Christ, we don't have any type of Christian that you meet or somebody who calls themselves a Christian does not take away the element of Jesus in that. Of course, we understand that from a historical point of view, as our authors tell us, is that we have to understand that the world into which Jesus himself came into is of great importance. It is very, very important. And it is important for us as we begin this journey with the history of the church to understand what kind of world that was. And of course, one of the things that we note is that when Jesus came into the world, it was a bit different maybe from the time of David or Solomon or Saul, that the Israelites were busy fighting and defending themselves. Actually, Jesus was born in a bit of a world which had some type of peace and tranquility. And we see that at that time, the Roman rule was in place, and Caesar Augustus was building an empire that would bring under Roman rule almost all of the developed world of its time. And this empire was to be centered on the Mediterranean Sea. So the Roman Empire provided security, swift travel, and communication and growth in prosperity. And in this form, it was to last for at least 300 years of the Christian era. Actually, it lasted until eventually Christianity, as we already know or we find in this book, was legalized and recognized. And the lands of the empire enjoyed a lot of prosperity. In fact, until today, some historians say that that part of the world never enjoyed such prosperity, such period of peace. Of course, at the time of Jesus, when we talk in terms of language, the language which was being used was Greek. Of course, Jesus himself spoke Aramaic, but because of the Roman rule, the Roman domination, Latin was spreading very, very quickly. And this also explains why the New Testament actually is entirely written in Greek, in the Greek language. But eventually you realize that Latin becomes used. In fact, we are told when Jesus was crucified, there was a plaque written and put on top of the cross there, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. And it was written in 3 languages, in Hebrew, in Greek, and also in Latin. But other things that we can notice about this Roman Empire was that desire of centralization, avoiding conflict where possible, and a desire to organize the empire in a very efficient way. And of course, the roads were built. We know about the famous Roman roads. We have piracy was suppressed and trade was fostered. Very, very important. And of course, the Romans were very intelligent people in terms of governance. They recognized that sometimes religion can be very divisive, especially in terms of religious practices. And actually, it wanted to bring about a kind of a unified religion, but also it had what we call a bit of an ideology, a bit of tolerance to what they would call tribal religions, but there were certain things that people were not allowed to do, so that to make sure that there is no that division that comes from people having different ways of worshiping and believing. However, in spite of all this great organization, you realize another thing historically, that public and private morality was in decline. Even though the Romans wanted to teach virtue to people, especially from a philosophical point of view, we realize that this was not the case, especially in certain things. Of course, the empire brought a lot of wealth to Rome. And because of this, actually, something else came out. There was a lot of laziness, especially in the upper class, because people didn't need to toil. There was a lot of luxury. There was a lot of sensuality, a lot of pleasure in terms of eating, in terms of socialization, in terms of sexuality. And other things started happening. There were degenerate practices such as child prostitution, public executions as a form of entertainment, brutality towards slaves, infanticide and abortion were common in the cities. And many yearned for a teaching that would free society from this corruption. So we see the yearning of this society. At a certain point, people got sick of it. And of course, all these factors provided a fertile ground for the seed of Christianity to bear fruit. And of course, we see at the beginning of the church with people like St. Paul and other apostles, a great missionary activity that expanded very quickly. And again, Christianity was a little more accepted in the society. Why? Because it seemed to be less tribal religion in comparison with Judaism. And even the manner of entering into the Christian faith was through baptism, something that anyone could access, both male and female. Remember, for the Jews, for you to be accepted, if you are a non-Jew, you had to be circumcised, and circumcision was only for men. So with Christianity showed a certain kind of universality. And by the way, the word Catholic means universal. Catholic means universal. So these things came from these kind of ideas. And that's why it's good for us to look at the history. And I love the way our authors present this book to us, because they do it in such a beautiful manner that helps us really to become grounded in terms of understanding our faith. I know for majority of us, maybe we feel as long as I say my prayers, I'm fine. But it's also good to have that a bit of knowledge about the history of the church. So we are going to take another break as we come and look a bit at the Jewish people, because the Jewish people are important in our history as Christians, and also a bit about Jesus himself, because Jesus also is a part of history. I know we believe in him as our Lord and Savior, but also it's good to understand him, the Jesus who came in time and in history. So let's take a break as we continue with the Power of Reading program. You are listening to Radio Maria Nairobi, a Christian voice in your home, and this is the Power of Reading program, a book review program, and I am your host and presenter, Sister Beatrice. And today we have begun our journey with a history of the Catholic Church, a book written by Fathers Norbert Bruckmann and Umberto Pescantini. And this book, actually, as I mentioned at the beginning of this program, we are going to do a serialization for the next 5 programs so that we can enter a bit into the mind of this book, because the book is presenting to us more than 2,000 years of history. So it is not easy for us to look at it just briefly as we would do or we have already done with many other books. Now, as we continue looking at this history, we have already seen the world into which Jesus came. Then what about the Jewish people? What was happening to the Jewish people as our history as Christians, so to say, was beginning? According to our authors, they tell us that the Jewish people before the Christian era were never a major power, and they suffered invasion and destruction. But what set them apart was their religious tradition, a firm belief in one God, a conviction that they were a chosen people of God. And even though they were sometimes unfaithful, Jews were never abandoned by God, and they kept the faith, the monotheism alive, the belief in one God, during a time when other tribes practiced idol worship and human sacrifice. Of course, the Jews, as we already know, traced themselves to a single ancestor, a common ancestor, the patriarch Abraham, who was inspired to bring the first peoples to the land of promise, the promised land. And after centuries, one of the major clans found itself in exile in Egypt, where its ancestor Joseph had been taken as a slave. And this clan grew large and was led out of exile by a great leader, Moses. And Palestine was again claimed and taken by the chosen people. And on their long trek through the desert, God spoke to Moses, and Palestine was again claimed and taken by the chosen people. And of course, we know that there is that experience of the Mount Sinai where they made a covenant of friendship with God and they were promised a savior. Now, when again the authors here, they present to us the land of Palestine, and actually they say it's a very tiny strip. I'm sure some of you listeners have been there, and we know that actually it's not a very large piece of land. And this land strip of Palestine was also at a crossroads of commerce and was key outpost for any would-be world power. And that's why we find that the Jews were many times conquered by Egypt, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and eventually Rome. Of course, under their great kings, David and Solomon, they knew some glory, but much of their history is one of alliances and also subservience. You know, they were under somebody always. And of course, we know that the lowest moment for the Jewish people, or their lowest point, was the captivity in 587 BC, when the Babylonians sacked and looted Jerusalem, burnt the temple, and took many of the people into exile. And it was 70 years before the people could return to Jerusalem. And the clans fought with one another and broke into rival kingdoms of Israel and Judah. So we know that also the Jews had rivalry against themselves, and that also was a bit of a big challenge for themselves. And of course, through the centuries of foreign dominations, the Jews always looked for God to keep the promise of the covenant, to send a liberator, a savior, and God spoke to them through the prophets who denounced their evils, especially injustice, infidelity. So all this history that we find in the Bible actually is repeated here by our authors in a, we can say, more historical manner rather than a spiritual or scriptural manner, but it is very faithful to what we find in the scriptures. And they tell us that in the 2nd century before Christ, the Greeks, led by the brilliant Alexander the Great, conquered the Middle East, including Palestine. And under his successors, Greek customs were introduced, some of them deeply offensive to Jewish ways, as we find especially in the book of Maccabees, 1st and 2nd Maccabees. And those who refused to sacrifice to the pagan gods were persecuted. Women had their sons circumcised. The women who had their sons circumcised were executed with their babies hanging on their necks. An image of god Zeus was set up on the altar of the temple, and pigs, an unclean and forbidden food, were sacrificed in the temple. And of course, this abomination, led to a 5-year guerrilla war led by Judas Maccabees and his family, and they were successful for a century, and Palestine knew freedom. Unhappily, Maccabees turned into religious fanatics and became corrupt. They forced the Gentile residents to become Jews. Those who did not often lost their lands and properties, and even manipulated the elections of the office of the temple high priest. And of course, initially Rome watched at a distance, but the conflict over succession to the throne brought Roman intervention. And the foreigners supported this occupation. Now, initially, the Romans, when they conquered the world, they wanted to create what we would call independent states, whereby they have an eye on that nation. The nation pays taxes to them. They bring their development to them. But for Palestine, they had to bring someone to rule over them because there was a problem with the succession. And Rome ended up ruling Palestine as a protectorate and did not actually colonize it. Control was exercised through the king and the local chiefs who were under Roman domination, and religious freedom was returned to Greeks and others within the country. But it was also extended to Jews throughout the rest of the empire. That gave rise to the open Jewish communities in every large town, and this was to be the major factor in the spread of Christianity. So what was happening to the Jews actually became also a blessing for Christianity, we can say, for us. Because of that presence of the Jews around the Roman Empire, it was easy for Christianity, or it was possible at least, for Christianity to spread around the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire also wanted to be an ideal society. They did not want to have a society where they bring in slaves. They have that whole movement of capturing people and having all these big populations, but being able to generate wealth through the people in their own place. Now, by the time Jesus was coming into the arena, we find that there are certain factions that can be mentioned and which our authors mention for us here, and which we actually meet in most of the scriptures. Some also meet them in the historical books. The first thing is Hellenists. The Hellenists were Jews who adopted many Greek ways and spoke Greek, and they tended to be educated, more sophisticated, and wealthier than other Jews. Examples of these Hellenists in the scripture we find in Acts, the Acts of the Apostles, where even the Gentiles complain about their own widows and all that, and they had to choose the 7 deacons. And among these, we find some of the Hellenists. Apostle Philip was a Hellenist, Stephen, the first martyrs, and many early disciples. So the Hellenists were Jews who adopted many Greek ways, even though they remained Jews. And actually, some of them become very active in the Christian arena. Then, of course, we have the Sadducees. Of course, we meet them often. We meet them also in the Acts of the Apostles. And these were actually aristocratic nationalists. It was actually a priestly class associated with the temple high priests. And these Sadducees were actually conservative in both religion and politics, opposing any rebellion or rioting and disagreeing sharply with those who taught doctrines like resurrection, which were not based on the first 5 books of the Bible and the only books they accepted as authoritative. Though generally opposed to Christianity, actually some priests from this group of the Sadducees did embrace the new faith. Then, of course, we have our famous Pharisees, as presented here by our authors. And what did the Pharisees do? The Pharisees provided the religious leadership of the masses and were the chief rivals of the Sadducees. The Pharisees were actually laymen rather than priests and believed in the resurrection of the body. And above all, they lived by the law, spending their lives in its study and elaboration. This law, the Torah, was both written and oral, and the great apostle Paul was proud to proclaim, "I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee," as we read in Acts chapter 23, verse 6. Now, St. Paul is my father, so I'm a daughter of a Pharisee. In other words, he's our patron saint. We are daughters of St. Paul. So we see again the Pharisees. Sometimes when we look at them, we think of them as really non-Christians, but some of them were converted, and we have a great example in St. Paul. Then, of course, we have the scribes, and this supplemented the theoretical interpretation of the Torah given by the Pharisees with practical moral teaching by handling legal matters. They were legal experts who could be either Pharisees or Sadducees. So the scribes was not actually completely a different group, as our authors are telling us here. They could also be, you can be a Pharisee and be a scribe. In fact, sometimes the scribes were called the lawyers. They were the ones who handled the legal matters of the law. Actually, they dealt with everyday affairs like marriage, temple taxes, religious practices. They were enormously influential. They controlled the higher schools and provided judges in Jewish courts, and they actually bitterly opposed Jesus himself and persecuted the early church, the scribes. Of course, there was another group called the Essenes, who were followers of an unknown teacher of righteousness who rejected the compromises and corruption of the Hasmoneans. The Hasmoneans are the descendants of the Maccabees. They lived in the desert in communities, practiced baptism, and expected the arrival of the Messiah to be soon. For that reason, they did not marry and lived a monastic life. And of course, one of the people who is believed to have been an Essene is John the Baptist. John the Baptist lived among them. They were wearing camel hair and they lived an austere life. Of course, we have the Zealots. The Zealots were the anti-Roman subversive group. They were against the Roman rule, something anti-religion. And for them, they resorted to violence and assassination campaigns, especially against Jewish collaborators. Now, at least one of the apostles is identified as a zealot. Simon the apostle is identified as a zealot in Luke chapter 6, verse 15. Then again, another term or another group of people are the people we call the diaspora. And this was the name for the communities of Jews who lived outside Palestine. In numbers, diaspora Jews were several times those in Israel, and their community formed a base for the entry of Christianity into the Roman Empire. So we are reviewing this book, A History of the Catholic Church. I'm sure you can already see how beautiful this information is for us to be able to understand better our faith from this book, A History of the Catholic Church, by Fathers Norbert Bruckmann and Father Umberto Pescantini. Let's take a break as we continue also to look at the early church. The authors have already presented to us about Jesus, which you already know much about. Actually, they have not dwelt on it much, but from the historical point of view, it's good to say something about Jesus. Of course, they also talk about Paul as an example of the early Christian ministry. And of course, chapter 2 deals with what we call the persecutions. Of course, the early way of preaching the gospel was sharing. In fact, these authors are very interesting. They are calling it the gossiping of the good news. They call it the gossiping of the good news. And eventually, this experience made it possible for the faith to start spreading. And the early covenant tended to be from among the classes of people who were marginal members of the Roman society. So the first converts were people who were overlooked even in the Roman society. For example, the slaves, we have simple people, women, and of course merchants, people who moved around, artisans, people who were ignored by the larger establishments were the first ones to embrace Christianity. Now, we have just reached in chapter 2 of this book. Actually, we have not even done all what we can do with chapter 2. So in our next program, we shall continue from here because we want to serialize this book as part of a review, because it is not a book that one can just give an overview about unless you just say it's about the history of the church. But the history of the church is very vast because we are talking of a period of time more than 2,000 years. And that is a very big space of time. And we need time just to digest this beautiful book. And also, as we continue celebrating this time of Easter, the Easter season, we also know this is the time we also celebrate the birth of the church. And it's good for us to take that step and look at our history thank God for it, and learn what we can to be able to understand what we are living and experiencing today. And for today, that's all we had for you, dear listener. If you are not able to follow all our programming for today, I encourage you to visit the website page of Radio Maria Nairobi and be able to download the podcast, which you can be able also to listen and to follow. And of course, I'll take this opportunity, as usual, to thank Mr. Timothy Morethi, who faithfully records this program for us, edits it for us here at Pauline Studio Nairobi for Radio Maria Nairobi. And until next week, I still encourage you to continue reading. Let us read books. Let us grow in our knowledge, in faith, in our own development together as we grow the culture of reading. I've been your host and presenter, Sister Beatrice from the Daughters of St. Paul.
You have been listening to the Power of Reading program. Join us next week as we continue discovering the wonderful world of books. This program is prepared for Radio Maria Nairobi and presented to you by the Daughters of St. Paul.